So as the morning headlines focus on Russian President Putin's saber rattling of potential use of nuclear weapons in response to Ukraine's reported deployment of U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles, today's presentation by Ambassador John Sullivan of his recently published Midnight in Moscow, a memoir from the front lines of Russia's war against the West, could not be more timely. A native of Massachusetts, a graduate of Brown University and Columbia Law School, Ambassador Sullivan has had an extraordinary career in public service as well as in the private sector. Ambassador Sullivan clerked for fabled Judge John Minor Wisdom on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, followed by a clerkship with Justice David Souter on the U.S. Supreme Court. After 10 very successful years with the Mayer Brown law firm, in 2004, in the George W. Bush administration, he became Deputy General Counsel of the Department of Defense and subsequently General Counsel at the Department of Commerce. He eventually was Senate confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Flashing forward the 8 years back at Mayer Brown during the Obama administration, in 2017, John Sullivan was appointed by President Trump as Deputy Secretary of State, serving as acting Secretary of the Department in March and April of 2018, following Secretary Rex Tillerson's departure. In 2020, he was confirmed as President Trump's ambassador to Moscow, then asked by President Biden to remain as ambassador, which, as we all well know, is highly unusual and a tribute to the degree of bipartisan respect in which Ambassador Sullivan is held. Ambassador Sullivan's uncle also was an Ambassador Sullivan, namely William Sullivan, our ambassador to Iran. On a personal note, years ago, Ambassador John Sullivan and I were comparing notes on our parents' greatest generation service during World War II. His father was in the South Pacific, mine with the D-Day landing in the second wave at Omaha Beach. Wounded when his LST was struck by a German dive bomber, my father, a surgeon, dug a foxhole on Omaha Beach, while through the night the Germans rained artillery fire down on the beach and traded fire with a squadron of American destroyers pulled perilously close to Omaha Beach in support of the beleaguered American infantry force. His uncle, William Sullivan, was a young naval officer on one of those destroyers, directing suppressing gunfire at the German artillery positions and saving many an American life that night. It's a small world indeed. And actually, I'm very grateful to your uncle because but for him, I might not be here today.
You're welcome.
So on that note.
Well, the thought occurred to me in light of what President Putin announced overnight, that he was changing Russian nuclear doctrine so that a nuclear weapon could be used in response to a massive aerial attack on Russia's territory. That, you know, it put me in mind, especially since John's book is entitled Midnight in Moscow, of something that had been a fixture of the Cold War, for those of you who are, I shouldn't say old enough to remember it, we're all that, but who care to remember it. And that is that a very left-wing and anti-nuclear group called they published the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, had this device on their cover that was a clock face. And the key thing was that the hands of the clock pointed toward a few minutes before midnight, 5 minutes to midnight notionally, and then the hands would get adjusted by the editors closer to or farther away from midnight according to how dangerous they considered the American administration to be, typically. And that's usually a barometer of Republican administrations, which tended to move the hands closer to midnight, and Democrat administrations that tended to move them farther away. Blessedly, that's all kind of in the past, a bit like the dustbin of history, except that both John's title and Putin's announcement do kind of now remind us, well, you know, are we at risk with Russia of stumbling into or venturing into uh, applications of force or other decisions that could unintentionally or accidentally lead us to some kind of cataclysm? We can take our safety for granted for now more than 70 years after the end of the war, but how long can we take that for granted, and what must we do to make as sure as we can that our world isn't wrecked by bad decisions? Well, John can help enlighten us about that from his perspective in experiences in Russia. And with that, I'm going to let him do it. John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Chorba and Ambassador Hughes, thank you for your kind words, and it's so good to be here with everyone. I really feel at home. And Ambassador Chorba started with a story about his father and my uncle, my father's brother. While my uncle was on that destroyer, the USS Hambleton at D-Day, my father was on a submarine in the South Pacific. So two brothers, the only children of my grandfather and grandmother. So U.S. Navy World War II combat veterans. An interesting story about my uncle's ship. So after, with his squadron running aground to provide fire support to the U.S. Soldiers and troops who had landed on Normandy, his ship went to the Boston Naval Shipyard, got refitted, and went to the Pacific, and was at the invasion of Okinawa, and then was one of the lead ships in the fleet, because it was a destroyer minesweeper, one of the lead ships in the fleet into Tokyo Harbor, with a Japanese admiral on the bridge with a map of the harbor, mines, hazards, and so forth. I mention all that, my family, Ambassador Chorba's family, and I think probably for many of us around the table, our families, what would they say about us today? You know, and I'm not talking about current politics, Republicans and Democrats. I believe, and something I talk about quite a bit, our leaders, both sides of the aisle, I think have failed the American people in describing our position in the world, the United States position in the world, and what we should be about. But I will I'll give you a brief overview on Russia, Ukraine, Russia, and what I believe is the threat that this enemy, unlike Senator Vance, the vice president-elect, who declined to call Russia an enemy, said adversary. Putin already calls us an enemy, says, and this is before the decision by the Biden administration on the ATACMS, the longer-range strike weapons. So it's the security challenges that we face. It's not an a la carte menu. You can't say, well, we won't support Ukraine, but boy, we're going to dial up the heat on Iran, which will help address things in the Middle East, and we'll turn up the heat a bit on the. It's all interrelated. It really is. You look at the relationship between Moscow and Tehran, Moscow and Pyongyang, Putin and his dear friend Xi. You can't just pick and choose which conflicts you're going to address in the interests of U.S. national security, because they're all interrelated. And one question I got recently, whenever something happens, major development with Russia, my phone explodes because I get requests for comment. As a former Biden administration official, President Biden's ambassador in Moscow, but also a Trump appointee as deputy secretary, and my first year as ambassador, as President Trump's ambassador, people are always asking me about, what about Russia's, 10 or 1,000 or more North Korean troops fighting for Russia in the special military operation. And the latest event, of course, was, as Ambassador Hughes mentioned, was the decision over the weekend by the Biden administration to allow the use of these ATACMS, these long-range strike weapons. These are not intercontinental weapons. These have a relatively, compared to some missile systems that we in the United States have, a relatively modest range of 190 miles, significantly farther than the HIMARS and other missiles that the Ukrainians currently have in their arsenal. So more effective, but these can't strike Moscow. So, one of the questions I got, relentless, everybody asking, the political timing of this. Did he wait until after the election? Did he want to decide it before? And my first reaction was, good God, I hope politics, and I understand I'm as deep in the deep state as many of you around the table. I get the Washington angle to all this, but my God, if we're making decisions about the national security of the United States, and I mean capital N, capital S, real security challenges, if we're making those on the basis of electoral politics, where's the courage? Where's the leadership? Are you that afraid of your own shadow? Are you that anyway? So I've been on I'm not criticizing directly Republicans or Democrats. I think there's enough blame to go around. So let me try to explain why I have this view, particularly with respect to Russia. So I went to Russia, and Ambassador Hughes will appreciate this. I went to Russia, and I analogize it to somewhat to Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, right? Mm-hmm. I was a South Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's court, right? I'm not a Russia expert. I don't speak the language, unlike some of us here today. I don't have a PhD in Russian history like my DCM did, Bart Gorman, who was my DCM for my first 2 years, career senior foreign service officer. But I do have a lot of experience working in Washington, working in the federal government, and I had the benefit of 3 years as Deputy Secretary of State, engaging with the Russian government, with the Putin government, with the Russian MFA. So I knew what I was getting into. I knew what they were like. And so what I offer you today, it's less an expert opinion and more an eyewitness, what I saw when I was there. And from the moment I arrived, it was clear to me this was a government that wasn't interested in doing business with the United States. It was not, as Margaret Thatcher famously said about Gorbachev, someone that she could do business with. Putin is not someone that, in my opinion, any American president, including President Trump, can do business with if that president is interested in protecting and defending the United States. The consistent response I got from senior officials from Putin on down, and I have to say up front, I wrote about this in my book, I had no complaints about access to Russian government officials. I met several times with Putin. I met with every senior foreign Russian government official, every minister, deputy prime minister, etc. The one exception was the Minister of Defense, Shoigu. Shoigu boycotted me because when he was Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis declined in an upfront, undiplomatic way to meet with the recently departed Russian ambassador at the time, Anatoly Antonov. As Mattis, Secretary Mattis said to me at the time, "Why would I waste my time meeting with that guy?" So I got a similar reaction from Defense Minister Shoigu, has now been relieved of his responsibilities. But I got to meet with everybody else who matters, and the consistent response was when I would from whether it was a call to discuss a particular issue, and there were some that were top of mind, or just an introductory, let me get to know you, introduce myself to you, so that we can work together on those areas where we can productively work together. to a person, the response went like this. I write about it in the book. I cite one particular meeting with the then energy minister, a guy named Novak. He's now a deputy prime minister. I walk in. I'd requested the meeting, but he was hosting, so he spoke first. And he read from his notes in Russian, doesn't speak English. And it was as if I had written his talking points for him. His presentation to me was, Mr. Ambassador, what's happening now, this is in early 2020. I got confirmed in December of 19, arrived at post in early 2020. So he says, the state of U.S.-Russia relations today is terrible. We both know that. And it's no way for two great countries to conduct themselves. We've got to stop the downward spiral. We've got to stop the hole we're digging. I mean, these were some of the metaphors that I was using as I was preparing to come and when I arrived in Moscow. My charge was from the administration, from the Trump administration, was to work with the Russians in those areas where we could, space cooperation, Roscosmos and NASA, strategic security talks, discussions about whether we would extend the New START treaty, work with them in those areas where we could, and oppose them vigorously as necessary in those areas where our interests weren't aligned, where they were undermining U.S. interests, whether it was election interference, the Novichok attack in Salisbury, etc. So I go in with an open mind, and the message I'm hearing from, in this particular case, Minister Novak, is starting to resonate with me. And I remember sitting there thinking, making notes to myself, okay, where can I try to work with this guy? Where can I try to make an inroad so that we can try to do something productive? And he's going through his talking points, and he's renewing how important it is for him, for his ministry, to have a better relationship with the United States. Okay, ready to go. He's just about to turn the floor over to me. He comes to his peroration and he says, "In this awful state of affairs, Mr. Ambassador, is entirely the fault of the United States. So I'm interested in knowing what you're going to do about it." And we were talking about our interests at Ambassador Hughes and I, and Ambassador Chorba. I have an appointment as a distinguished fellow at Georgetown. And I remember when my wife and I got married, the Catholic Church required us to go to something called pre-Cana counseling, for those of you who are Catholic and have been had to go through that before the church would marry a couple. And I remember one of the things I learned was, and I still remember it almost 40 years later, was communication blockers between spouses. One spouse says something, the other spouse says this, and that's a communication blocker. You need to communicate. Boy, this was the mother of all communication blockers. How the heck? Where do you take the conversation from that? Imagine one spouse saying to another, "Our marriage is a wreck, and it's all your fault. What are you going to do about it?" You mean you're going to divorce court over that, right? That's the response. That's the Russian attitude toward the United States. And you can list all of the nefarious things they've done to us, to the United States, and to our allies and partners, whether it's on the streets of Salisbury, the murder in Berlin, just as I was arriving as ambassador, where the FSB sent a colonel, not some agent, not some unknown hireling, maybe from a third country. This is an FSB colonel sent to assassinate in public on the streets of Berlin a Chechen opposition leader. He did so with 2 shots to the head in a public park in front of a whole lot of innocent Berliners, including men, women, and children. This is the government. And Putin, by the way, that individual, Krasikov, was among the Russians that were released on August 1st of this year, when we traded for Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, etc. The first person off the Russian plane bringing the Russian prisoners who were being traded by the West back to Moscow, the plane lands in Moscow. A red carpet is rolled up to the stairs leading from the plane. The first person off the plane is Colonel Krasikov. Putin strides up to him and hugs him. This is the enemy we are dealing with. Putin's term, not mine. So I serve in Moscow as ambassador, my tenure was disrupted by two things. First, the pandemic. I got stuck there for 13 months. I couldn't travel. And then as Ambassador Chorba mentioned, that the Biden administration asked me to stay. So I was there. I was with President Biden when he met with Putin in Geneva on June 16th, 2021. There was concern then, because there had been a Russian troop buildup in the spring of 21 in southwestern Russia and in Crimea, near the border with Ukraine, in the spring of 21, that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. The assessment, and this was leaked and was publicly discussed in the West, the assessment of, in particular, the U.S. intelligence community was that Putin wasn't doing this. This was signaling, negotiating tactic, etc. But that wasn't a unanimous consensus across NATO countries. And MI6, the UK's Foreign Intelligence Service, had a slightly more pessimistic view. I'm with Biden. Biden meets with Putin in June. At that point, the Russians have said some, not all, some of those troops that have been mobilized back to their garrisons. But what was left were fuel depots, ammo depots, some infrastructure, particularly in Crimea, that wasn't broken down and removed. It was there and could be used in a future hostile action against Ukraine. So Biden meets with Putin in Geneva. And what did they not talk about? Ukraine. They talked about a lot of things. They talked about the Arctic, wrongfully detained Americans, Navalny, you name it. The list is as long as my arm. Afghanistan. At that point, President Biden had announced earlier in the year that the United States, following through on what President Trump had planned, was going to withdraw from Afghanistan. President Biden said then by September 11th. I was there when he talked to Putin about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which made the Russians a little uncertain because Afghanistan is a lot closer to the southern border of Russia than it is to any border of the United States. And the Russians were concerned about terrorists in Afghanistan getting more of a free rein under the Taliban. So Biden talked to Putin about that. They didn't talk about Ukraine. There were some fleeting references to the Minsk agreements, but there was no conversation about Ukraine. Putin then, after that meeting between Biden and Putin, they have back-to-back press conferences. We had agreed in advance there wouldn't be a joint press conference, Biden and Putin. It would be Putin first and then Biden. Putin speaks first. First question to President Putin from the media, it's from Russian state media. I can't remember now. I forget whether it was which Izvestia, which Russian state media it was. Doesn't matter. It's Putin if it's Russian state media, it's Putin asking himself a question, right? And the first question is, and I'm paraphrasing now, Ukraine is obviously the most important issue to every Russian. Tell me, Mr. President, what did you talk about with President Biden about Ukraine? Putin says, we really didn't talk about it. Biden said he wants Ukraine to comply with the Minsk agreements, and that's our view. So we hope that he will convince his vassals in Kyiv to do just that. I believe it is the case. Biden listed, I think it was 11 things at the start of his press conference that he and Putin talked about. I think it was the 11th item, a fragment of that sentence mentioned Ukraine. I emphasize this because by the end of November, just months later, Putin is saying publicly that what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat to the continued existence of the Russian Federation. What changed between June 16th and this speech he gives to the Russian Foreign Ministry at the end of November of 21? Nothing. Looking back now in hindsight, I'm convinced, at least by June of 2021, Putin had decided what he was going to do. He was going to handle Ukraine. He was going to accomplish what he has subsequently announced as his war aims, denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. He was going to do it, and there was nothing he needed to talk to President Biden about. And in fact, as I look back on it now, that summit meeting, which people have completely forgotten about, but my impression of Putin, and this is at the time, and looking back at it now, putting it in context, not discussing Ukraine, Putin's whole approach to the meeting was loose, genial, smiling, cracking jokes. So when they were talking about, the two presidents are talking about U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And President Biden says, and we're losing our counterterrorism, we will lose our counterterrorism platforms, our bases, our facilities in Afghanistan. We want to try to reestablish a small platform in Central Asia to substitute for that. And I want to ask you, Mr. President, to not oppose our effort to do that, because you have sway, particularly in Central Asia, former Soviet republics. And I know sitting there, Putin is adamantly opposed to any U.S. military facility, particularly in a former Soviet republic. But what does he say? He doesn't say no. He sort of, he cracks a joke and he pokes Biden a little bit. It's not obvious. So you have to put it in context. He says, well, Mr. President, maybe we'll let you have access to our 201st base, which is a large, huge Soviet-era Russian base on the border in southern Tajikistan, on the border with Afghanistan, that the Russians still use. One of their few bases in another country, extremely important to the Russians. And Putin is saying, with a smile, well, maybe we'll let you share our base. So my side of the table, there were, those of us who were with President Biden. I sat next to the secretary, that was Biden, Jake Sullivan, seated at the table. And I'm seated across from the chief of the general staff, Colonel General Gerasimov. Why the Russians brought their most senior uniformed officer, we still don't know. We had no one in uniform on our side of the table, and not even the Secretary of Defense. It was the State Department and White House. And it was equivalent on the Russian side, except they had Colonel General Gerasimov seated across, and he's seated across from me. And the room itself was small. The table was narrow. It's about as narrow as the table I'm sitting at now. And Gerasimov is right across from me. And I'm looking at him as Putin says, we'll let you share our base. And Gerasimov is not KGB trained. So Gerasimov goes, and I said, boy, he's cracking a joke. And then later in the conversation, it wasn't about Afghanistan. It was, I forget what, it may have been in the Arctic. Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov started to join the conversation. And at one point, Lavrov speaking to Biden. And Lavrov saying something, and I can't, the substance isn't important because Putin again, this is an attempt, an Archie Bunker-like attempt at ethnic humor. He takes his right hand and he puts it over Lavrov's mouth, who's seated to his right, and he says to Biden confidentially in a low voice, translated from Russian, "Be careful negotiating with him, Mr. President. He's Armenian, i.e. he'll pick your pocket." And he laughs at his own joke. Lavrov chuckles. Those of us seated on the American side are like, what the heck? Just sort of an odd thing. I look back on it now. He's cracking jokes. He's loose. He knows what he's going to do. He is a very confident person in his position. At his press conference, again, another dig at Biden. This is not quite as subtle. Putin's asked, after the question about Ukraine, at his press conference, Putin's asked, well, what do you think of Biden? And Putin says, well, he's very experienced. I've known him for a while. He's very experienced. He's very capable. I've got to know him very well. He's a man with good moral character. And I know that because he often tells me stories that his mother told him. And they're not relevant to anything we're talking about, but he tells me stories about his mother. And I guess that shows he has a good heart. I'm watching this in the prep room, big conference room that had set aside for Biden. I was literally standing next to the president when he said that. And my first thought was, a KGB guy like Putin, he's famously said there's no such thing as a former KGB man. A KGB guy talking about you telling irrelevant stories about your mother, that's not a compliment. In his world, that's, again, to quote Archie Bunker, that's a shot, I read, if you remember dialogue from All in the Family. That's a shot. That's Putin. He had decided in June what he was going to do. People often ask me, did the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan prompt Putin to invade Ukraine? Heck no. He had already decided what he was going to do. The role at Afghanistan, the debacle, the terrorist attack on August 26th, if there were, as subsequent diplomacy by the United States as we tried to deter Putin from invading after it became clear that's what he was going to do, we had lost the ability to deter at that point. And Afghanistan just confirmed that he thought that the West wasn't going to be able to stop him from doing what he was planning to do. So it didn't prompt him to do it. He didn't decide, aha, now I will invade. It made it impossible, as difficult it was going to be, to deter him from invading. So I'll fast forward, and then I want to get to your fast forward through the chronology that leads to the invasion and my thoughts, and then turn it over to you for questions where you'd like to take the discussion. The U.S. intelligence community, starting at the end of October, became convinced, and this is collectively a group that is virtually incapable of reaching a conclusion that they're 100% certain of, right? They were virtually certain that Putin was going to invade Ukraine starting in late October. Bill Burns is sent to Moscow. I happened to be home when this first briefing by the intelligence community at the end of October occurred. I was summoned to a meeting with Secretary Blinken. He took me into a secure video teleconference organized by the White House. We got the briefing. Burns is then charged by the president with going to Moscow to speak to Putin and other senior Russian leaders to say, we know what you're planning to do. Don't do it. The consequences, sanctions, export controls, will be catastrophic. Nothing like what happened in 2014. This would be a calamity for Russia. Don't do it. The Russian reaction from Putin on down, I traveled with Bill to Moscow, hosted him at my residence and for his meetings, and the reaction from Putin on down, Putin was even more confident, and his subordinates confident and arrogant about their ability to handle anything that was going to happen with respect to Ukraine. To a person, they denied that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. That was always the starting point. Well, of course we won't invade, and we have no plans to invade. But if something happened in our neighborhood that required us to address a security threat, we'll have you know that the Russian military is back. Over more than a decade, we've invested a substantial amount of military in our military. So we're capable of handling anything that happens in our neighborhood. And yeah, we're not the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. And your export controls, your sanctions, they hurt. They continue to hurt. You may ratchet them up. You've got to do what you've got to do. But thank you for your interest, but there's not a problem here. So we came back, flew back. I flew back on Bill's plane. He wrote a memo for the president laying out what he had heard. And the assessment was that Putin was going to do it, was likely to do it, but we weren't 100% certain that he had decided this date, I'm doing it. So after those meetings, the Russians engaged, and I lay this out in my book, sham diplomacy And I just give you one example of what I mean by that. The Russians, when I would meet with them, would read from their talking points in talking about Ukraine or security generally in Europe. They would read from their talking points. I would speak as I'm speaking to you now. I'd be well prepared, I hope, and have read everything that I should have, but I wouldn't have a script. I wanted to react to what their comments. So I would engage with them, and their response would be to go back through their notes to find the talking point that was most relevant to the question I had just asked and reread it. There was no give and take. There was no negotiation. There would be no negotiation. They presented to me 2 draft treaties in mid-December, one between Russia and the United States and the other between Russia and NATO. And they were presented on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. They were not going to negotiate about the terms, and the terms of the treaty as drafts, as I write about in my book, would no U.S. president would ever accept the limitations on NATO, rewriting the Atlantic Charter, etc. No U.S. president would. They knew that. This was sham diplomacy. They wanted to tell the world, not the world so much. They don't care about NATO capitals or the capitals of our allies and partners, but the so-called global South, Delhi, Beijing, you name it. We tried. We gave the Americans a chance. We engaged in diplomacy. And they're the ones the Americans, are the ones who are threatening us. Relentless NATO expansion east, etc., undermining Ukraine with their color revolutions and so forth. So it's sham diplomacy. And just one minor example. I cite a number in the book. The draft treaties they gave me. I think the date was December. I could be off by a couple of days. December 15th, 17th. It was a Wednesday. They hand me 2 draft treaties, and I look at the documents, and the documents are only in Russian, which is not the way we do business, right? Now, the Russians, when they present a document to the United States, it's presented in their official language, which is Ruski, which is Russian, but they always, in every case, without exception, provide a courtesy English translation, and we do the same. When we present a document, we present it in our official language, and we always, without exception, provide a Russian translation. And the Russians delight. I can't tell you how many meetings I sat in where they correct our Russian grammar. It's a courtesy for them that we've provided a Russian translation, and they'll chuckle among themselves at some grammatical error that they think they've found. So they present these 2 drafts to me in Russian. And it gets worse. They say, it's this Wednesday morning, mid-morning, and we want to negotiate these 2 drafts starting this Friday in Geneva. And what? Less than 48 hours? Why? What's the rush? What's up? This involves the national security of the Russian Federation. There is an existential threat to Russia from NATO in Eastern Europe, and particularly the United States in Ukraine. This is an emergency. We need to negotiate these 2 draft treaties with you in 48 hours. Now, remember, this is mid-December. In mid-June, there was nothing for the U.S. president and the Russian president to talk about. What changed? Nothing. It's a sham. It's a fake crisis that they have created. And I observed, said, you've given me, I pointed out to them, I said, you haven't given me a courtesy copy in English. I've got to have these 2 documents, and they're relatively short. For those of you who are of an age to remember when people used to dictate things, they were dictated but not read. They were sloppy. And I don't speak Russian, I knew these were sloppy drafts. I'm going to have, you say you want to meet in 48 hours. This meeting that's 48 hours from when this meeting started. It's now 47 hours and 15 minutes. I've got to have these treaties, drafts, translated. That's going to take time. The notion that everyone from the President of the United States on down is going to get these drafts translated by me, by the embassy, formulate a negotiating position for the United States, put together a negotiating team, have that team get on a plane and travel to Geneva to snap a biscuit off our nose because you want it, is absurd on its face. And the Russian response, if you're not there, we plan to make the 2 drafts public and just reveal your lack of interest in diplomacy, sham diplomacy. We knew they were going to invade. I was telling people from starting in early January, I had every 2 weeks, I would have a video town hall with the AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow. When I arrived as ambassador, we had 1,200 U.S. companies doing business in Moscow. And a lot of these people were among the most expert. I mean, these are American business leaders, but many of them had lived there for decades. Some of them had Russian spouses, spoke the language fluently, understood Russia. They were my toughest audience to convince that Russia was going to do this. Oh, you're chicken little, Mr. Ambassador. Stop scaring people. He's never going to do it. He just wants to make you think he's going to do it because he's trying to press you in negotiations over Ukraine. It's irrational. He'll never do it. I disagreed. I was right. They were wrong. Where I was wrong, and we all were wrong, was on Ukraine's ability to resist. Led by Zelensky, the man in the moment met, and the Ukrainians were able to resist the special military operation that Putin thought would be over in 2 weeks. They gave orders to senior military leaders who were leading their troops into Ukraine to bring their dress uniforms with them to participate in victory parades after the major combat operations were over. Some of those Russian generals, of course, were later killed in action in battle in Ukraine. So that's a lot of what I write about in the book. The latter part of the book is culpability for this, what the West should do, what the United States should do in response to this aggressive war. But maybe I'll leave that in it to questions and anything else you'd like to talk about.
So actually, you've got a stationary mic there.
Oh, is this for me?
So everyone knows, put up your flags. Ambassador Rosa Peps was up first. So Ambassador Rosa Pep, floor is yours. Okay. Hold on. Grace is going to bring the mic around. I'll endeavor to be heard without one.
You say you're not a historian, you say you're not an academic expert on Russia, but you know a lot about Russia, you know a lot about Putin, you know a lot about them. So what I'm curious about, and I've been curious about it this whole time, this whole couple of years, is the why. I guess he really believed he'd get control of Ukraine in 4 days. So that's bad intelligence on their part. I get that. We have intelligence, they have intelligence. But he ended up with, the way I look at it, he got NATO on his border with Sweden and Finland. He's pissed off the population of the biggest country on his western flank, which has the closest cultural relationship with Russians. It seems to me like a century impacting bad decision. So I'm curious as any insight you have from working with him, working with them, is how they get it so wrong.
You're absolutely right in your perception. I've heard my friend Secretary Blinken lay out the case for all of the strategic defeats, and I mean capital S strategic defeats, lengthening of NATO's border with Russia, the humiliation of the Russian military, the degradation of the Russian military, 700,000 casualties, the Russian Black Sea flagship on the floor of the Black Sea, all these things, right? Even so, and Putin has admitted that he was wrong in the following sense. The then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett came to Moscow. It was about a month or so after the special military operation started, and he had a meeting with, shows you how the world has changed, right? Given what happened on October 7th, the idea that Netanyahu would be traveling to Russia, a little far-fetched given Russia's relationship with Tehran now, enhanced relations. In any event, Bennett is meeting with him, and Putin says to Bennett, this is as told by Bennett, not said by Putin, but as told by Bennett afterwards to the media. Putin said, yeah, we weren't as good as we thought we were. we, the Russian military and the security services, particularly the FSB, I believe the biggest Russian failure in Ukraine was by the FSB, not by the Russian military. But significantly, he said, yeah, we underestimated Ukrainians' will and ability to resist. So this is going to take a lot longer than we thought it would. He's saying this, say, beginning of April of 2022. 2.5 years later, more than 1,000 days since the special military operation began, if you asked him and you gave him a truth serum so he wouldn't call in his KGB training and lie to your face in a very convincing way, he'd say it's still it's everything that's gone wrong, it's that important to my vision, our collective vision of as Russians, to restore the so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And the original heart of the Ruski Mir, as many of you know, is in Russian Kiev in Ukrainian, Kiev and Rus. I mean, this is the heart of what it means to be a Slav. And there's always a kernel of truth in what he says. It's why he's such a good liar. When he says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that we're all Slavic sisters and brothers, he's right. I can't tell you how many friends I had in Russia who were born or had family in Ukraine and vice versa. For most of my tenure as ambassador, his principal officer in the Office of Presidential Administration at the Kremlin, his deputy chief of staff responsible for dealing with Ukraine, a guy named Kozak, is a Ukrainian. He used to speak, before the war started, he would speak almost daily with Yermak in Ukrainian. This is essential to his vision of what Russia is in addressing what he calls the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He's got to address that. It's tied into, obviously, the humiliation. Some of us were talking about this in dealing with Russia in the mid-90s, when Russia really was not just knocked on its heels, but knocked on its rear end. And Russia was humiliated. Putin is looking to address that. He holds it against us in the West, and particularly the United States. But it's more than that. When he talks about the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, it's not the demise of Soviet communism. He's not a communist. I suppose you could be a communist and have $1 billion palace in Sochi on the Black Sea, but there's a little tension there. But he's not a communist. In fact, he famously says, he uses an old Russian expression. He says, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to go back to the Soviet system, you don't have a brain. So the great catastrophe was not the demise of the communist system. In fact, in his opinion, it was the communists, Gorbachev, going all the way back to Lenin, who undermined Russia's relationship with Ukraine. No, the great political catastrophe was that border of that huge landmass, 350 million people, the USSR. That international border went poof, and the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union that separated the 15 Soviet republics became international borders. And that's the border between Ukraine and Russia that he cannot tolerate. In the same way, and I write about this in my book, his motivation, he can't tolerate that border the way Hitler couldn't tolerate the border in Eastern Germany that separated East Prussia, that creates the Danzig corridor growing out of the Versailles Peace Treaty, and puts, in Hitler's words, his Volk, our Volk, always using the possessive, our Volk, our Germans, on the wrong side of a phony border. And our Germans are now being subject to Hitler's expression, Polish barbarism. People didn't use the word genocide back then. If they did, he would have said genocide. It's the same argument Putin makes. The Soviet Union's collapse meant there's a phony border in Russia's southwest that separates our Ruski Mir, our Slavic sisters and brothers. So there are now Russians, as he conceives of Russia and Russians, on the wrong side of this phony border, who are the subject of a Ukrainian genocide by Nazi-inspired maniacs, a criminal Nazi gang in Kyiv. Pure fantasy. Some of the rhetoric he doesn't believe, but the core goals he believes to his core, and that's why he's willing to sacrifice 700,000 Russians, maybe 7 million Russians. That may be too much. There comes a point at which the Russian people can't support the sacrifices they're being asked to make. One final point, anticipating a question about sanctions. Have sanctions and export controls worked? Absolutely not. It hasn't deterred Putin from the special military operation and continuing to pursue it. But what Putin's doing, he's sacrificing Russia's future, the Russian people's future, for this imperial goal. And it's in the following sense. Inflation is rampant in Russia today. The central bank has raised the prime lending rate to 21% and is threatened to raise it higher. There's going to be stagflation. Projected growth, there's still projected growth in Russia for 2025, but it's gone from 2.5 or even higher down to under 2, maybe even under 1.5% for 2025, and then projections further out as defense spending goes up. And defense spending includes not only on the defense industrial base, but I saw an article last week in the Wall Street Journal, they called it Deathonomics. The payments both to recruit soldiers into the Russian military and to pay death benefits are going way up. What's the consequence? We lived with this in the United States. We keep talking about, Ambassador Hughes and I, how old we are. For those who are old enough to remember, you remember Guns and Butter, the war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, 500,000 troops sent to Vietnam, to Southeast Asia, and the Great Society, right? Great Society programs leads to a huge problem for the United States, inflation in the 70s, right? Which in the first half of Reagan's first term, with Paul Volcker as chair of the Federal Reserve, that we've got to wring that inflation, huge cost to the United States, all spurred by a decade before, those decisions by the Johnson administration, particularly about the war in Vietnam. It is that same problem on stilts in the Russian Federation with what Putin is doing, spending for his war. It's not going to impact Russia or the average Russian today or maybe next year or maybe even the year after that, but soon, and it's going to be a structural problem that is going to be burden Russia for a long time to come.
So, Ambassador Eco.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today, Ambassador. This has been terrific. Thank you. This has been terrific. I have a question about your assessment of Putin's willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons. The Biden administration has consistently slow-walked every request for a weapons system from Ukraine. We finally now agreed to give them the attackers missile, which I think we should have given them in 2022.
Right.
And the fear, apparently, what I've always heard is that slow walking has come from the National Security Council and John Sullivan, and basically because of a fear of nuclear retaliation.
Right.
My assessment is that Putin's not stupid.
Right.
He's not going to use nukes. And in particular, if we pointed out to him that, hey, we made a deal and we made Ukraine give up their nuclear capacity. And if you introduce nuclear weapons, we have to give it back to them and have to let them use nuclear weapons, So is that what you want? I mean, just lay it on the line and say, you're not going to get away with it.
So, yeah, I share your view, unlikely in the extreme, that Putin would use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield in Ukraine. He would be irradiating what he considers Russia's homeland. My friends from former Chairman Milley on down in uniform told me that there isn't there isn't a tactical or strategic battlefield advantage to using a tactical nuclear weapon. I've thought that the only time I thought in the last couple of years that he might consider it, it would have been, well, hypothetically, it's a hypothetical. Imagine instead of it being what we called the Wagner Group, right, the Prigozhin-led private military contractors that had become, in effect, an arm of the Russian military, a militia in Ukraine. When they start their march, their mutiny, and their march, their drive north from Rostov to Moscow, and shooting down Russian helicopters. If that was if that was the Ukrainian military that was on the march to Moscow, now we're talking. Now maybe, but Ukraine is not capable of doing that. At least not now. So, I've always thought that the fear of nuclear weapons use by the Russian Federation was grossly overstated. Easy for me to say. I'm not the commander-in-chief who's responsible for the national security of the United States. What I thought was a more legitimate concern, which would have been a substantial problem, not the same as the use of nuclear weapons, but there were really two things that I recall from our discussions both before the war started. And by the way, the discussions about HIMARS and ATACMS, that predates the start of the special military operation. There were discussions within the interagency led by the NSC about HIMARS and ATACMS, right? So this has been going on for years, and it's been extremely frustrating for many of us who thought that the Ukrainians should be given the ability to defend themselves, particularly because we talk about long-range strike weapons. It's 190 miles is the range of the ATACMS, which is long, accurate, devastating weapon. But it's not going to strike Moscow. It's not going to threaten the regime. It may threaten those Russian military institutions and groupings, and maybe even some of their ally, the DPRK's troops, but only so that they don't threaten to continue the special military operation against Ukraine. Ukraine, if the war ended, if Putin surrendered, Ukraine doesn't want any Russian territory. In fact, there are parts of far eastern Ukraine I'm not even sure many Ukrainians would want back. So this is not threatening the regime. But what I thought was the more legitimate concern was use of conventional weapons by the Russian military to strike marshalling areas for equipment going to Ukraine in NATO territory. And then we have a military strike on a NATO ally, Article 5. Now we've got war between NATO and the Russian Federation. That's why he hasn't done it. And any of those incidents that we've seen reported in the press, where there have been missiles that were off course or had been intercepted, but debris has landed in NATO territory. It wasn't an intentional strike by NATO. So I believe, my own personal opinion is that the concerns were overstated, that we allowed Russia to manipulate us, and we were self-deterred in ways that, if it's right to provide the ATACMS in mid-November 2024, why wasn't it right in November 2022? What's changed? One answer that the White House has suggested is the presence of North Korean troops. I am not a military expert. I will leave that to others to opine on, but from what I've seen reported in the press, take it with a grain of salt. I have no confidence, if I were a Russian leader, no confidence that those North Korean troops are going to be a net advantage to the Russian military. We've seen reports of friendly fire. Here's a fun fact, doesn't get discussed much. I believe it is the case that friendly fire, this is Russian on Russian, red on red, friendly fire shot down more Russian aircraft in the first month of the war than Ukrainian fire. Ukraine, in the Russian military, in that first year of the war, really was an abysmal performance. They have righted the ship just as they did in the Second World War in response to the original wave of Operation Barbarossa, and they're using the same tactics that their grandfathers did. I don't believe the DPRK troops, 10,000, 12,000, they don't speak Russian, they're not integrated, haven't been in Russian military planning. I don't see why that changes the calculus about providing or authorizing the use of the ATACMS.
It was clear that Ambassador Zico and Roosevelt put their flags up first, but 5 others went up afterward, and I can't tell in what order. So let's just, if I might, go around the table with Ambassador Gilmore.
John, thank you very much. I think it's been very instructive what you've said to us today. And I think that's a terrible story about that Putin-Biden summit. You know, what if the American president had said, never mind all this other nonsense, all these other 11 things. I'm going to talk to you about the most important thing that is important to America, and that's Ukraine. That would have been sending a political message to Putin. I don't know if it would have made a difference or not, but but to downplay it was the day when America was thinking, can't we all get along? Americans are like that. Why can't we all get along? And you can't get along with this guy. So my question is this: Putin has crossed the Rubicon. He pulled the trigger. He sent an invasion force in. He's now lost 700,000 people dead and wounded. He's all in. What are we going to do with this guy? You know, it's not a mistake on his part unless he loses.
Right.
It's not a mistake. What he did, that invasion, everybody said, well, he made a mistake. He hasn't made a mistake unless he loses.
Right.
Well, what are we going to do with this guy? I mean, how he can't back up, and we can't let him not back up because of the invasion. What are we going to do with this guy?
There is no negotiating with Putin. I say that, and my description of how we tried to engage with the Russians before the war started convinces me that there is no negotiating as we in the West understand negotiating, which is not to say we shouldn't talk to him. We should tell him things and listen. Americans aren't good at listening. Listen to what they're telling us. But he's never going to surrender his war aims. He will never tolerate the Zelensky government or a democratically elected successor in Kyiv. He will never tolerate not just Ukraine. He would obviously never tolerate Ukraine in NATO, but he'd never tolerate an independent Ukraine that had a sizable military. He wants to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. He says that repeatedly, almost on a daily basis, since the day the war started. He will never vary from that. He will not negotiate over territory that the Russian military has seized in Ukraine. Putin had the Russian constitution amended in 2020 to make it unconstitutional for any Russian leader to separate, to give away Russian territory that exists in the Russian Federation. He had the Constitution amended so that it is unconstitutional for him to say, Luhansk, Donetsk, okay, you can have it back. He can't do it. It's unconstitutional. Now, Putin, in fact, can do whatever he wants. But that constitutional amendment is not, I'm not talking about a legal constraint. It's the sign of his political will and what he will and will not do, and he will not negotiate. So my view is, as I write in my book, is that we have to adopt I cite as a precedent, the work of George Kennan, one of my predecessors as ambassador, who wrote a famous cable back to Washington called A Long Telegram, and then turned that into an article in Foreign Affairs published anonymously as X, and the title of it was the sources of Soviet conduct. what I urge in my book is a Kennan style, and it's important to emphasize that, a Kennan style containment policy for the Russian Federation. Now, Kennan has the germ of the idea and uses the phrase in his writings in the 40s, but it's taken and modified over time by the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, ultimately Reagan administrations in ways that Kennan ultimately came to disagree with. But this is Putin speaking. This is in his view, and he believes it, a civilizational struggle between the Russian Federation and the West and the United States. It's not an ideological struggle the way communism versus capitalism was. It's a civilizational struggle about Russia culture, the Russian culture, the Ruski Mir. And we need to brace ourselves for a long-term conflict with this. Our SACEUR in Europe, General Cavoli, said a month or two ago, no matter what happens in Ukraine, we're going to have a large, heavily armed, and angry Russia on the eastern border of Europe for a long time to come. Truer words were never spoken. So we have to be prepared for that. And to get back to where I started this conversation, American leaders aren't talking this way. The American people aren't prepared for the threats that are being that are posed both individually and collectively by Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang. This is an axis. I know there's a competition, at least in Washington, among foreign policy types to come up with a name for the axis. I won't hazard a guess there, but there's more cooperation between and among this axis than there ever was between the original axis, between Tokyo and Berlin throughout the Second World War. Much more coordination into the future. And that's, as I said, this is not an a la carte menu of conflicts. We can't just say, we'll surrender Ukraine and think we're going to deal with these other problems, or even with Russia itself. So what I say to my fellow Republicans who will say things, and I don't disagree with the importance of, for example, protecting the southwestern border of the United States, but when I hear people say, I'm more concerned about the southwestern border of the United States than I am with the borders of Ukraine. Well, first, it's not an either or. And I'll accept your premise. I've had these conversations before the election. Okay, I'll accept your premise. You don't care about Ukraine. J.D. Vance has said, I don't care about you. Okay, you have to care about Russia. What's your Russia policy then? How are you going to have a credible policy to address the Russian Federation if you think Putin is going to be more likely to engage with the United States in a way that is productive for the United States and its national security? Boy, you are no better than the old movie tone, new man on the street interviews from the 30s with those poor saps on the American street, microphone stuck in their face. What do you think about the German chancellor? Well, he's rough around the edges. Germany really got the short end of the stick coming out of the Great War. There wasn't a First World War at that point. It was only the Great War. What I say to my fellow Americans, Republicans, is you don't want to be embarrassed years later as the person who said, I don't care about Ukraine and Russia. What are members voting on in our defense budgets? There are others around this table who speak this more fluently than I on defense budgets, but just rough guesstimate, what we spend in our classified and unclassified budgets for both the U.S. military and our intelligence communities is $1 trillion. What are we spending all that money on to defend ourselves? It's not all about China. Yeah, China's whatever the expression du jour is, the pacing challenge, the generational challenge, blah, blah, blah. The immediate, dangerous, heavily armed challenge is Russia. And if you don't have a message for the American people that explains how you're going to deal with Russia after you want to surrender Ukraine or cut off U.S. support for Ukraine, that's not leadership.
Ambassador Oliver?
Thank you. This is really a fascinating discussion. My question, very briefly, is on Crimea.
Yep.
Putin won't negotiate. Zelensky wants all of his territory back again. Crimea was taken over in 2014. What's the U.S. position, or should the position be, on Crimea?
So it's interesting, the Trump administration's position, as Ambassador Gilmore knows well, articulated by then Secretary Pompeo, was to draw a dotted line on U.S. maps around Crimea, the way we did around the Baltic states, never recognizing the Soviet Union's control over the Baltic states. I don't, look, it's a, sorry, doing two things at once. The proposals, whether it's Elon Musk, J.D. Vance, others, that Land for Peace, I think what little I know about how Ukrainians think, there are some Ukrainians who I think would be more willing to sacrifice parts of Far Eastern Ukraine in the Donbass than Crimea. This is one, I think, if there is to be a resolution in the future or a ceasefire similar to what we have on the Korean Peninsula, this is one where I think Pompeo's dotted line is probably the best that we can hope for, never acknowledging Russian jurisdiction, just as we never acknowledged Soviet domination over, incorporation into the Soviet Union of the Baltic states. But the Ukrainians are never going, no matter what, Zelensky wouldn't do it. It's not something that he's interested in doing, surrendering territory for peace. But even if he wanted to, the Ukrainian people, you look at the polling, and just from what I know and talking to average Ukrainians, there's a level of animosity. I mean, to the extent that there was the grain of truth when Putin was talking about Slavic sisters and brothers across Russia and Ukraine, what he's done with this special military operation has driven tens of millions of Ukrainians, Russian speakers, who loathe Russia because of the brutality with which the Russians have waged the special military operation. If Zelensky announced that he was going to surrender the territory that the Russians have seized already, if he announced that today, he wouldn't remain as president. Similarly, if Putin announced that he was going to withdraw from the territory that Russia has seized, it would be difficult for him to remain as president of the Russian Federation. In Putin's case, it may be difficult for him to continue his life. His fear is, Rex Tillerson famously said, to me at least, I remember, I don't know how if he ever said this publicly, the problem for Putin is not staying in power, it's how, if he desires to leave power. He can't do what Lyndon Johnson did in '68. After the Tet Offensive, Johnson announces he's not going to run for re-election. He retires to the LBJ Ranch, right? Lets his hair grow. Putin can't just announce, this special military operation, it hasn't gone the way we thought, and retire to his palace in Sochi. So the conflict will endure.
Ambassador Goodman.
A little bit of change of pace. You wrote in your book about your 2 trips to the K-47 prison to meet with Paul Whelan. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could give us a little more color about that. You had to be a pretty grim trip, 8 hours there and 8 hours back, and had your security detail. And
yeah.
Probably pretty grim weather and shopping for food and gas. But how did that meeting get set up? Who did you have to go through? Was there a time frame you were given? Were there topics you could or could not discuss with him? Obviously, somebody else was listening as well.
Right.
My sense is that since he was still a prisoner on the date your book was published, that you might not have written as fully as you might have wanted to about that out of concern for his own safety.
Right. Well, his case and the way the Russians treated him and treated my relationship with him changed after he was convicted, Before he was convicted, he was physically in the custody of the FSB, and an FSB officer would always be present in the room with me when I would meet with Paul. And that meeting was in Moscow in Lefortovo prison, which is an original ancient KGB, NKVD, Russian Empire, Ukraina, old scary place. And everything I said to him had to be translated for the FSB colonel who was sitting with us before Paul could answer, and vice versa. Once he was convicted and sentenced to 16 years, he was put into the Gulag, the 21st century Gulag, the Russian prison system, FSIN, and sent to IK-17, this labor camp in Mordovia, as you know, an 8-hour drive southeast of Moscow. It's a long trip. It's 8 hours. If you look at a map, yeah, it's a long drive, but it takes much longer because there aren't a lot of highways, and the roads, it's a logging area, and the combination of the snow and ice and the heavy logging trucks, to use the word potholes to describe the rutted roads on the route to Mordovia, it's a lunar landscape. So driving with an armored vehicle around, it takes 8 hours. Once he got there, there was not a Russian officer present when I would meet with him. We were then, unlike in Lefortovo, where we could sit face to face, in IK-17 there was a glass partition, and I'd speak into a microphone, although I could hear him without a microphone. I had a microphone, he had one, and they were listening to what we said. But when I was in Lefortovo and there's an FSB officer present with a junior officer who understands English, he could stop any conversation immediately. He couldn't do that in IK-17, I think in part because it wasn't just that he had been convicted, but they'd realized that he wasn't an American spy. They could care less what he said to me because he wasn't, the only value he had was as trade bait. So it was important for me to go to see Paul just to try to keep his spirits up so that he knew that the American people and the U.S. government and the U.S. embassy hadn't forgot about him, because he was the only American, one of the few English speakers in this labor camp. In the labor camp, to try to paint a picture for you, this is a labor camp that was built in the mid-20s. It housed a large number of German POWs from Stalingrad after 43, and it hasn't been renovated since it was originally built in 1925-26. To walk about outside the gated camp, the roads aren't paved, chickens, goats wandering aimlessly around. It's a grim place, and he's the only person, one of the few people who speak English there. So living there, he wasn't in a cell, they're open barracks, and he was in a barracks with mostly foreigners. I think a large number of them were Tajiks, who treated him well. He didn't feel physically threatened. There's a gang system in the Russian prison system. Our prisons aren't a great place to spend any time, and there's a hierarchy, and he had to follow the informal rules of the labor camp, but he never, he wasn't assaulted. He had some medical issues that they ignored. It was tough, but mentally it was really hard. He spent almost 6 years detained. That's a hard, without hope that he was going to be, and they would play mind games with him, suggesting there was a trade in the works when there wasn't. And for me, it was important to see him and so I could then talk to his family, tell him how he was doing, give him some hope that we were working for his release. I just like getting outside Moscow and driving around the countryside. And Moscow, as I tell people who ask me, I loved living in Moscow. It's a beautiful city. you get an hour or two outside of Moscow and you're back in the 50s. I mean, it is, and so that when I read about, for example, payments to the family of a Russian soldier killed in Ukraine, which seemed pretty modest by our standards, $15,000 in the equivalent in rubles, it's a huge amount of money for a family living in a village far outside of either St. Petersburg or Moscow. Interestingly enough, I call Mordovia. I think you're from Minnesota, so I called Mordovia the land of labor camps because there are a whole bunch. Like Minnesota is the land of lakes, Mordovia is the land of labor camps. There are labor camps everywhere. And Trevor Reed, subsequently convicted after Paul was in IK-12. So I could see both of them on one trip. There wasn't a long drive between the two. And I'd stay at, this was kind of funny. It was a miscommunication between me and my colleagues at the embassy the first time we went down there. We stayed at, what I was told was, I would stay on my first trip, because I'd stay overnight, drive down, probably see Paul in the afternoon, stay overnight, see Trevor in the morning, and then do the 8-hour drive back. And overnight, we were staying at the Econo Lodge. I said, Econo Lodge? There's a Howard Johnson's in Mordovia. What? No, it's the Econo Lodge. What? Okay. It was the Echo, ECO Lodge. And it was Echo, it was a Russian attempt. It's a hunting lodge, a modern big log cabin, a hunting lodge and fishing lodge on a lake. And wealthy, there's a helipad, wealthy Russians go there to hunt and to fish. They have some pretty big Siberian dogs. Huge, I'm a dog lover. I mean, big dogs that I got to play with. Real bearskin rugs that had been shot not far from the lodge, and it was Echo, ECO Lodge. So grim circumstances, grim reasons to be going down to IK-17 or IK-12, but I did look forward to those trips.
If I might, it's 2:30, so could we combine maybe Ambassador Holwell and Ambassador Cobb will ask their questions and you could
Sure.
answer?
I'm going to make mine very, very. How does Putin define the Russian war? Does it include the Baltic states, Georgia, the stands?
So that's a lot of different, it includes at a minimum, there's already a union state, right, between Belarus and the Russian Federation. So between Minsk and Moscow. What I've always maintained is he doesn't necessarily have to absorb Ukraine as into the Russian Federation. He wants a union state at the start that is Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and he builds from that. So Moldova, Georgia, the Caucasus. Yeah, he considers, the Central Asia, the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, that's a lower priority. The number of Russians who live in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, I know in Latvia, when I was in Riga, the percentage of the population that is considered Russian, that speaks Russian, it's pretty big. It's like a third of the population. So I think in the pecking order, in the priority order, in the time Putin has left in his mind for his reign, Ukraine is obviously top. He's already gone to work on Moldova and Georgia. I don't know that he's got the capacity for much more. He'd have to really accelerate. And to absorb NATO territory into the Russian Federation, I don't know that he's up to that. One fun fact, just to talk, and I focus on Latvia. I had a senior FSB general that I dealt with on counterterrorism issues, Oleg Siromolotov, and he was out of central casting, KGB trained, heavy smoker, big bear, literally big bear of a man, out of central casting. He's Latvian. He was born in Latvia. He got an aeronautical engineering degree and went to work for an arm of the KGB, which is Aeroflot, now an arm of the FSB. And he was a senior FSB officer. He's moved nominally to the foreign ministry. He's their chief negotiator on counterterrorism issues, but he's a senior FSB general. He considers himself a Latvian.
And Ambassador Cobb.
Mr. Ambassador, absolutely fascinating. You are a unique observer, and we're so appreciative of you to be so candid and share. You are also a unique observer of State Department organization and politics. Several of us were impressed with Rex Tillerson. In fact, I had a conversation with Bob Gates the day after he recommended to Trump that Rex Tillerson would be by far the best Secretary of State. Sue and I knew him, and others, I'm sure, around the room knew him. Why was he such a failure? I mean, or at least a failure in the eyes of the Foreign Service officers and the MAGA Republicans and even the traditional Republicans. What happened?
Yeah.
And tell us about your relationship with it. I mean, you must have had several meetings where you say, look, I don't think things are going well here.
So I became very close with him. Whenever both of us were in Washington at the State Department, we would have lunch together, which is not the way things operate in the State Department. I don't think I was close, but it was a different type of relationship with Secretary Pompeo. We would start every morning before 7 in his office with, just the two of us and his chief of staff talking about issues. With Tillerson, it was over lunch, and it wasn't so much what's happening today, who's going where to do what, as a bigger picture discussion about important issues. My opinion, there hasn't been a Secretary of State who had the experience, and this is why Secretary Gates and Secretary Rice so strongly endorsed him. If you think about it, he ran an organization, ExxonMobil, interestingly enough, roughly the same size as the State Department, 75,000 employees, with operations around the world, including in dangerous, hostile places. He had been used to dealing with as chairman and CEO for 11 years. World leaders, presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, oil ministers. He knew most of them on a first-name basis. He'd managed this big organization. He was very proud of the fact he was good at security. He was very proud of the fact that while he was chairman and CEO, ExxonMobil had no fatalities in its operations worldwide. Couple of things happened that he was only there for 13 months, so I was going to say got him off on the wrong foot, but he wasn't. I mean, that suggests there was a long march. There wasn't a long march in his tenure. Before he was confirmed, and this wasn't widely publicized, it was known, but it wasn't widely publicized, OMB, the president, and OMB decided to drastically cut the State Department budget without consulting with the Secretary of State designee, Rex Tillerson. Separately, he had his own, based on his 43 years of management experience at ExxonMobil, how to improve, his own ideas about how to improve the operations of the State Department, which I always thought was in some ways tragic that we never got to do the things that I had an inkling needed to be done as deputy secretary. But when I went through the process of moving from deputy secretary to becoming ambassador and serving overseas and seeing how we operate, I thought, my God, we really did need redesign, which is what it became known. Secretary Tillerson's plan for reforming the State Department became known as redesign. The budget decision and redesign collided. it was all attributed to Tillerson, and it became known as gutting the State Department. He was not looking to gut the State Department, but he was tarred with the budget cuts that he wasn't consulted about, didn't approve, but because he is a man of character, a Boy Scout, an Eagle Scout, a man of his word, he felt obliged, and he was, as any cabinet secretary would be, to respect the president's budget decision. So he embraced it as his own. Once he became confirmed, was presented the plan from OMB about the budget cuts. He took it all the way to the Oval Office, and Trump overruled him. He then went out and tried to sell the budget cuts while also trying to do redesign. And it was just, all of his messaging got lost in, he's gutting the State Department, he's laying people off, and that wasn't what he was planning to do. So that was what I observed at the start of his tenure. If he had been a savvier Washington insider, maybe that means a man with less character, he would have felt less obliged to identify and embrace the president's budget cuts. But he thought, I work for the president, and if that's what he wants, he's saluted. Now, his experience, it's really hard. I've seen this happen with another cabinet secretary when I was Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Carlos Gutierrez, who was our Secretary of Commerce, had been the chairman and CEO of Kellogg. And this was a somewhat similar story, although cereal as opposed to oil and gas. He spent his whole career at Kellogg, rose through the ranks, started as a delivery driver in Mexico City, became the youngest chairman and CEO in the history of Kellogg. Extremely successful. Kellogg was very popular. He was really at a loss in how to operate. He just could not understand the things it was difficult for him. He learned, he's a quick learner, but just coming in, the things he thought he could do, which he had no authority to do, or either legal or political. And similarly with Secretary Tillerson. Secretary Tillerson was a little more sophisticated, I think, in the ways of Washington. But I remember once I came back with him to his office, we'd been in a meeting, and there was a list, this is old-fashioned, a stack, which is the way he liked it, a stack of, the old pink telephone call slips, Senator X, Senator Y, Senator Z. And he looked at them and like, it's late. And I could tell his mind was thinking, geez, I wish I could just go home. Because he then turns to me and said, when I was the CEO of ExxonMobil, I'd make one of these senators' day by returning his call. Or maybe I wouldn't return any of them. I didn't care. And what were they going to do to me? Nothing. Now, this is the ranking on this committee, and it's just a different world here. And it's no matter how sophisticated they are, the only one I saw, and he had his own unique management style, who was able to, and he began his career in Washington before he became a CEO, was Don Rumsfeld, who was able to, he had management instincts, very successful, 2-time CEO of Fortune 500 companies, but also as the youngest and the oldest Secretary of Defense in history. So, conclusion about Tillerson, he was in many ways undercut by the White House in ways that he would never discuss publicly. It went beyond the budget. So Jared Kushner negotiating in the Middle East. Eventually, what he accomplishes over 4 years is the Abraham Accords. But very frustrating for Tillerson because he knew, particularly in the Gulf, he knew all of those leaders on a first-name basis. And Jared is doing his own thing from the White House. Very frustrating for Tillerson. But the budget thing was what really undercut him at the State Department. And once he was on that slippery slope, it was just not possible for him to recover. And his fractious relationship with the White House meant he got fired by tweet in March of 2018.
A fascinating afternoon, I think you'll agree. Shall we thank
Thank you.
John Sullivan?